to make sure that I'm doing those things that are needed and necessary for community first, right? So I just wanted to make sure that some of the things that are needed are getting done, right? And so I figured I'd go ahead and do this today, again, as requested. I'm trying to still get set up a little bit, so it's a little bit, it's one of those days. I'm just having one of those days. Everything is just kind of really going. So as I get set up, just give me a couple of minutes. If you're following along on YouTube, I have I have a website up that has some links to some information. It is my website that I compile bibliographies on. So please feel free to join us on YouTube and follow along over there so that you can find some of that information and get access to some of that information. Hi, Donna. I don't know why I said Donna. It's good to see you. Good to see you. And you can find some of the resources that I have for this information over there as well. And I am not going to talk about communities specifically here. I don't, that's not something that I feel is appropriate. I think that communities have the right to dictate what gets shared and what doesn't get shared, and that culture keepers are the people who should be doing that sharing. And I'm not a culture keeper in any community, and so I would not find it appropriate for me to share culture. I want to go over some of the information, though, on how we find people coming to the Western Hemisphere and the timelines that we find people coming to the Western Hemisphere, and what the information that's coming across in anthropology and archaeology and science these days actually means when you break it down, right? So many times all that information is kind of compiled in ways that makes it very hard to read, or very hard to understand, or very hard to really see the bottom line of what's being said. And I want to make sure that that's easy, right? I want to make sure that we are able to break through the gatekeeping and break through the jargon and break through the bullshit, so that we have knowledge and understanding of what's going on for our communities. But again, I don't feel, again, I'm not going to be sharing culture. I mean, I'll share some European documentation of what they found when they got here, but not sharing actual culture actions, just because of the fact that that's something that should be reserved for culture keepers. It's not something that even community members really should be. In my opinion, I, as a community member, do not feel that I should be coming in and sharing information. I believe that culture keepers have an understanding of what information should be shared and what information shouldn't be shared much better than I do. And so it's not something that I personally feel is appropriate unless somebody is a culture keeper. And so because of that, I'll go ahead and let you know that I really won't be sharing a lot of cultural information. I'll just be sharing the scientific information that we have, and the information that we have that Western science is starting to finally confirm of what Indigenous science and Indigenous stories and histories have been telling us. History is such a weird word, because everybody thinks history is like the history of us, but really it just means written story, right? And so when I say Indigenous histories, it's a little bit kind of it's a misnomer in it, right? Because we're talking stories that actually have a lot more fact to them and a lot more reality to them than Western written stories do, because in written word, there is the ability to sleight of hand. In written word, there is the ability to write it from a winner's perspective, right? And very often written word isn't written from the perspective of the people who are living the thing, right? And so written history is an extremely problematic thing to me. It is actually way more helpful and accurate to me to have oral tradition. Oral tradition, many people don't understand. Many people think of oral tradition as a game of telephone, but written history is much more a game of telephone if you think of how often people are translating this and translating that, right? Whereas in oral tradition is something where I'll use the Druids on this one. Druids actually have writing, right? This is Owen on my neck, right? And this is a form of writing that the Druids had, that the ancient Celts had. And this form of writing is something that they used for things like so and so was standing here, right? And they would write letters to each other, and they would do many different forms or usages for this writing. What they did not do with this writing was document facts, document science, document history, document the things that needed to be remembered and understood, because they believed, and new studies are actually proving, that once you write stuff down, it's easier to let it go. It's easier to not remember it. And yet, if you teach something in a 3-line stanza that has an iambic that will actually increase memory. And iambic is the way that the words flow. Think of iambic pentameter, which is used by Shakespeare, right? It's the way that the words flow. Iambic pentameter means the flow of the words is a 5, the beat is a 5, pentameter, right? So the flow of the words with the Druidic people, or with Celtic culture, was a flow that you can remember, right? And the way that the words were done was done in a way that you remember. So if I repeat, never wake a sleeping animal, never wake a sleeping animal, never wake a sleeping animal, until you understand the entirety of that sentence, never wake a sleeping animal, right? And you've repeated it back to me 100 times, word for word, without ever deviating. Now I go on to my next. And of course, this is done in 3 lines with the Druids. It's all done in multiples of 3 for Druidic thought process, for ancient Celtic thought process, right? So you would have a 3-line stanza. Never wake the sleeping animals is actually an ancient Druidic thought. It does come in a whole 3-line stanza that I can't remember the entirety of right now, but it is actually like within the Druidic teachings is that you should never wake a sleeping animal. So if I teach you that over and over again until you can repeat it back to me word for word, and I do that with each stanza until you can repeat back to me hundreds of stanzas word for word, there's no game of telephone involved. On the other hand, if I were to write it down and you were to translate it out of Ogham into Irish Gaelic and then into English, it was going to lose its meaning. It's going to change the concept. It's going to affect the understanding. And in that affection of the understanding, in the way that it affects the understanding, oftentimes it'll change the meaning. And so knowledge is lost much easier with written word than knowledge is lost with oral tradition, oral understanding, oral cultures who keep all of their knowledge in an oral thought process, right? Right. And having that's actually, when you look at the Druids, they talk about the bards within the Druids, right? They talk about how the bardic class within the Druid is really the teachers, and it's really just like a level, right? And that level is teaching, and the teachers go out to all of the different communities among the Druids, right? And they would sit and they would teach, and they would teach in those songs, they would teach in stanzas, they would teach in a way that you can memorize it. And so you get to the point that your memorization is of the entire piece, word for word. You're not losing anything in the translation, right? Nothing gets lost in translation because there's no translation, right? So I think that that is an extremely important concept to understand when we're talking about Western science is now confirming so many different oral traditions of the Western Hemisphere, right? Of Indigenous oral science and Indigenous tradition. 1 second. I can't do this right now. She needs to be with you because I'm in the middle of a live. Or in her room. Come here, little girl. Come here. Come here. Come on. Come on, little girl. Come on. Come on. Apologies, all the changes in my house recently have made it to where I really don't have a space that's just mine. And there's also different animals in the house now, which sometimes make it a little bit difficult to try. And I can't focus on this and focus on the fact that I have an intact male and a female puppy who's in heat. I have to keep them separated, or, and the female puppy is mini dachshund, or not, sorry, my male is mini dachshund, and the female is part Great Dane and part Pit Bull. So she's like a 70, 80 pound, 10-month-old baby. And I don't want babies from that combination. It would be really a bad combination to have babies from. She is sweet. She is so kind and so generous. And I would probably end up with little scrappy doos, but I really don't want little scrappy doos running around my fucking house. And I'm pretty sure that my dog would get injured in this situation. He's 6 inches tall and she's like 10 times his height as it is, right? So I'm like, can't focus on that and focus on this. So my house is chaos right now. My partner is out here sleeping on the living room couch next to me, right? Like it's chaos right now. Again, I wanted to go ahead and talk about the Western Hemisphere and being an Indigenous to the Western Hemisphere today, and what Western science knows about indigeneity to the Western Hemisphere today, because it is something that was asked, because there is a lot of, because of the way that things get lost in translation, and because of the way that Western thought tends to think of itself as the be all and end all, right? And, we were talking last time we were in live, we were talking about the start of writing. And many people date the start of writing as cuneiform, but hieroglyphics predate cuneiform by like 1,000 years. So technically the start of writing would be in Egypt with cuneiform. Right. And yet now we also know that there's caves 27,000 years old of Homo sapiens that have writing in them. Right. So when we look at this, Western thought likes to think that it's really the foundation of all knowledge, right? Everything comes from it, right? And it's actually instead a group of people who had knowledge and willfully got rid of their knowledge and entered into a space of ignorance for 1,000 years, and now once again think that they are back on top of all of it, right? So when we're talking about the arrival in the Western Hemisphere, and we're talking about how people come to the Western Hemisphere, and about who was here in the Western Hemisphere when European arrived on the Western Hemisphere and invaded in the Western Hemisphere, those are the kind of things that I want to talk about and bring in. And I'm going to remind you guys that over on YouTube, actually, I did this a little bit differently today, so let me do it that way. Over on YouTube, I am on my website. So YouTube is up there, which we don't need this one because I have it in the background. YouTube is up there. If you're over on YouTube following along, I'm over on this website, and the tab that I'm on is Sapien in the Western Hemisphere currently, but I'm actually going to take us, this is under the tab Rewriting the Western Hemisphere, and I'm going to take us to pre-Sapien finds in the Western Hemisphere. Thank you, Adrian. I appreciate that. You know what? I'm so sorry. It finished. What the heck? Dismissed. Let me restart. I apologize. For some reason, it is not over there. I thought I was live streaming this whole time over there. When I tell you that my day has been really chaotic. I'm pulling it up right now. It'll take me about 2 seconds to get through all of the little things that they want me to do to start the stream. I don't know why it dropped it. It still says that I'm sharing. It still actually says that I'm sharing the tab that I was trying to share. So it's really funny that it's not actually sharing it over there. Let me double check. Yes. Okay. So it is up over there with the tab open. Well, I do talk about the ancient peoples across Europe. I haven't recently. North Georgia mountains, though, would be where we see the Gravatians starting out. Like the earliest people in that area are going to be the Gravatian period. And if you are on my website, or you do go onto my website, you'll see under bibliographies, European ancestors. And under European ancestors, I'm pulling that up on YouTube if you're following along, you're going to see a few different things about the Gravachian culture. And the Gravatians aren't actually the first culture. The Ariatians are considered the first culture. And again, for those who do not know, these are names that we in modern science attribute to people. It does not mean that these are names that they attributed to themselves or anybody knew them at. This is just what we're attributing them to. And so when you're looking through that, do understand that. But there are some information on the Gravatians underneath the bibliographies. Gravatian periods, the Gravatian people are all along the Mediterranean basin in the lower part of Europe, before and during like the Little Ice Age, right? Because we start moving into Western Europe about 50,000 years ago. And in that movement into Western Europe, there was then a little ice age that cooled and people were pushed back down and then back up. Thank you so much, Ink. How are you doing, Cass? It's good to see you today. There is some information there. I haven't done a live on it in a minute. And I'm actually just starting to do lives again because I was gone for a minute. And then I don't think on this account I have anything on the Gravatians on this for videos, but I do have the information over in the bibliographies. And then I do talk a little bit about the how we see Indo-Europeans moving around and, the settling into different spaces sometimes, though there are a couple videos on that, but I haven't done a live on that one either. In a minute, I'll make sure and do a live on that one relatively soon. Let me go ahead. We only have like 30 people in here. And it does seem to be, no, I don't do anything with angels. Sorry. And I don't do any numerology. Like I'm bad with numbers. Maths is not my thing. Geography, maths, and geology. And if you're watching on YouTube, I froze on TikTok and I'm opening it back up. It'll probably just go back and resume the live. I've been having some problems recently, so I apologize. It will freeze me and it'll drop me and I'll have to come back in, just so you guys know. Like if I disappear, that's why. I will come back. It'll just kind of pause it. There's no image on YouTube. Like, I'm sharing screen. It should, hold on, let me try and share the screen and see if it will do it now. Okay, so let me see if I can restart a couple of these websites. Oh, I see. Well, now I know why I actually have two tabs open. So apparently I'm dual streaming on YouTube. Let me double check. That's it. Okay, so I'm going to message the chat. I'm going to close this one. It is on the other tab open, still streaming, so I don't know how I ended up with two going. I apologize. If you want to come over into this other tab, it would help. I had to put her in the room because I'm live streaming. What's up? You can talk. It's okay.
I was just going to, is it okay if I continue playing my guitar?
I don't care. It's not bothering me. The only thing that bothers me is the dog. And it's not like she typically bothers me.
I didn't even realize I didn't close the door.
Yeah.
Love you.
Love you, baby. Okay. I think we just have one YouTube. Hi, beautiful. I know you too. I should be following you on this, right? Yeah, okay. So I only have one streaming right now. Thank God. I didn't know I had two up there. I hope whoever was in the other one was able to find their way over to this one. And YouTube, is the image up and is it working? Let me know. The static image of the skulls. Perfection. Okay, so then I'm pulling up the pre-sapien finds in the Western Hemisphere next. And there are about 3 different sites here that I have on this page. They go from the one that is dated as being the earliest, which would be Heotloco in Vascuela, Mexico. If I butchered that, I apologize. And this one has 3 different datings on it. The oldest dating on it, or the furthest back dating on it, is 800. It says KYA, which means thousands of years ago. K after a number is 1,000, and then years ago with it. So KYA, 800,000 years ago. And then one of the other datings is 250,000 years ago. The dating that they have that is the most timeline recent, right? The not as old dating that they have, but it isn't. Yeah. Anyways, is about 40,000 years ago. So there's a few different dates on Heotloco, and the reason is because you have different people who are arguing it, right? You get a find, and the first dating I think was the 250,000 ago. A find that says 250,000 years ago, you're going to have people that debate it, because plenty of people on the right side of anthropology and archaeology, and I do not mean that as being correct, I mean that as, conservative side of archaeology and anthropology are automatically going to scream that can't be correct, because it kind of, again, takes away that thought process that they themselves belong to the superior group, right? And so when that first dating came out at 250,000 years ago, somebody debated it, and their dating was 40,000 years ago. And then somebody else debated it, and their dating was 800,000 years ago. So Heotloca's different site timelines has been up for debate since, I want to say, the 50s. I can't remember. Let me look really quick if it actually has the date just right up here. I can see deceased dates on the anthropologists, but I can't see. Let me pull one up and see if it actually has when early 60s. So they found Heotloca in the 60s, and they have been arguing the dates on Heotloca the entire time. Heotloca is a site where there was actually a volcanic interaction, right? There was a volcano that erupted, and the volcano left a volcanic ash, and underneath that volcanic ash and volcanic glass is tools and artwork, actually, like pictographed artwork on stone, right? And so with that, what they are dating is the glass itself, the volcanic glass, and they're dating when the possibility of that volcanic eruption is, or that's at least what the earliest datings on it. I can't date stone itself. I have to date the things around it. Like they could date the cave walls themselves for cave art. What they could date is the patina that forms over the art itself. Because the patina itself has I can't think the word that I'm needing for it, but it had the substance itself is there's a specific word for it. But you can date things that have lived, right? So when they're dating things, they're dating the lived things in the area. They're dating like the seeds in the footprints in white sands is what they dated. The cave walls, they date the patina over it because it was once living parts of the biome that then died and, end up kind of being a part of the cave wall as it's dying, right? And so they're able to date those things. They're able to date the volcanic glass, not because they can date volcanic glass, but they can date when the last eruption is. Not oxidization. It's like the term for like, it's not living, but it's the term for like anything that is alive, like okay, so plants are alive, right? And animals are alive, right? And when we are alive, there's an interaction with the isotopes in the world around us, and all those different things for everything, right? And so it's the interaction with the world around us that when we die starts to biodegrade, and that's what they actually date, right? And yeah, so and the substance itself is what they're dating that I'm trying to remember the fucking word for it that I can't remember, right? It's just like way over here in my brain. I know it's there, but it's like blacked off right now. But there are several different forms of dating. Carbon-14 dating is the most unreliable of the dating methods. And so now anything that they date with carbon-14 dating, they also back up with what they call isotope datings. So there's like strontium isotopes, and I can't remember all of them because they're all some big words, but all of these are different. Like this one is uranium series dates. And what they do is they are dating like they can tell by the plants in the area when they grew by the isotopes, because they look at the isotope levels in the on the earth at different dates. Like they've been able as geologists to go through and date the different isotopes, right? And that's how they can track where you're from by the isotopes in your teeth, because they can track where those isotopes happened at what time in that area. Those things are a little bit too confusing for me to really be able to explain them fully and completely, right? And so I would just understand that carbon-14 dating is not the greatest of datings, and anything that states it has carbon-14 dating today usually has something else to date it up, that date it as well, that backs up the carbon-14 dating because of that fact, and that what they are dating is the different cellular interactions with the environment at different time periods, because science of geology and different things like that will give them the ability to understand when those atoms, those cells, those isotopes are interacting on the earth at which place, at which time. And so when they're dating, that's what they're dating. And so you'll see like the footprints that we see at White Sands, that they dated the seeds, not the sand itself, right? Not the footprints that have been compressed as itself. They dated the seeds, and they went, when were these seeds, the isotopes within the seeds, when were they pulling oxygen from the air? When were they pulling nutrients from the sun, right? Is basically what they can date with those isotopes, right? And then if we're scrolling down here, we see that there's the Calico site in California. Now, the Calico site is dated to 200,000 years ago. That dating has not changed. There is argument, right? There are people that want to state that that is not correct, right? But the Calico dating, the site for Calico Hill in California is 200,000 years ago. And Leakey, who started the Leakey Foundation, who was the foremost anthropologist in history, is somebody who worked on the Calico site, and he is who gave us the dating on the Calico site. He was very fascinated by the Calico site. He left Africa and came to North America to study the Calico site because of the dating on the Calico site, right? And because of what we see, or not because of what people thought about the Calico site when he got here. And so he was asked, he was invited, and he came over and he went, that's curious. Well, let's look deeper. And so he did the research on the site. He was actually mocked, I guess would be the best way to put it, in the scientific community. Like, it actually kind of like knocked his chops down a little bit, right? Because people were so against the, not Mary herself. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. Let me see, because I know I have it in here. I think it's Leo. I think it was Leonard Leakey. I know it's LSB. Let me see if I have the full name. Lewis. It's Lewis. And so it was Lewis and Mary Leakey. Yeah. So Lewis Leakey worked on the Calico site. Absolutely, absolutely. And Lewis Leakey worked on the Calico site, and it actually caused troubles for Lewis Leakey, right? because so many people wanted to discredit that thought process, discredit the idea that people could have been here in Western Hemisphere that long ago. It's important to note that at the time, people didn't even think that Homo sapiens were 200,000 years old, right? At the time, the thought process was that Homo sapiens were pushing it at 60 or 70,000 years ago. In fact, I think at that time, they still thought Cro-Magnon was the earliest Homo sapien, and Cro-Magnon is a singular skull who was dated to about 40,000 years ago. So I think in the 60s, they literally still thought Cro-Magnon was the early Homo sapien. How do people determine what plants to eat anywhere? Right, that's a part of being indigenous to an area. Let's go over how people become indigenous, right, really quick. When we look at what it is to be indigenous, being indigenous to an area is today defined as maintaining a spiritual connection to the area and maintaining a communal connection to not the area, but the land itself. Right? So you maintain a spiritual and communal connection to the land itself, right? And so how do you get to that point that you have a spiritual and communal connection to the land? Now, because we as a species, like every other species, speciates to fulfill a niche in the biome, something that the biome needs from us, something that the earth itself needs. And because our space in the biome is the biome's tending, we tend the biome, we give them this malleable brain that allows us to adapt our adaptations and to kind of understand things and to actually look at others and try and interact with others and try and have compassion and empathy for others, right? This is one of these things that we have that's a part of us filling this niche in the biome, right? And so we as tenders in a biome, as we speciate, as any species speciates, it knows what it can eat in the area that it's in, right? And so when I say start in Jebel Irud in North Africa, in Morocco, which is our oldest sapiens find, right, at 300,000 years ago, and I am in Jebel Irud in Morocco, I know the food in the area that I can eat. I know what plants make me feel better, right? Because everybody around me knows that. Because as we've developed as a species, everybody around us knows these things, right? And we eat what our parents eat, right? And our parents might be Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis, right? And our grandparents might be ancestor, right? Like, yet they're all eating the same thing. So we know what we can eat in Jebel Irud. Now, me and my group go to Iraq, where one of our oldest sapien finds is. It's 150,000 years ago, right? In Iraq, there's two caves in Iraq, one Neanderthal and one Homo sapiens, where we lived side by side for roughly 100,000 years, right? And I am moving my people over into Iraq. And as a group, as we're moving over into this new territory, some of the foods in this area are going to be similar. We see that wheat and barley is a plant that grows all over North Africa and all over Iraq, right? All over the Arabian Peninsula. We see that this is a natural plant that's growing anywhere. We're going to know that we can eat the meat of anything, right? Because we've known that we can eat the meat. We're going to know that we can fish, right? And so as we're moving into that area and we see a new plant that's in that area, we might test that new plant. How am I going to test that new plant? I most likely am going to already have in space scientists within my group, because we know that science is as old as Homo erectus, right? We see that science is something that Homo erectus themselves developed to actually give you the phone that you're using today, because it's their usage of fire and their adaptation of tools that is actually, science that gets us to the point that we get a phone, right? So I have members of my group, even if my group was only 30 people, who are already scientists, right? So me and that scientist, maybe that scientist sees a new plant and they go up to that new plant and they take, that whole plant probably, because I need to know which parts of the plant I can eat and which parts of the plant I can't eat, right? Now, this scientist, like every other scientist before them within their community, within my community, they've been taught how to make sure that they're processing this, how to make sure that they're tasting it and not killing themselves, right? So maybe what I do is maybe I find a plant that has I'm sure that this is not correct, but maybe I find onion for the first time. Okay, maybe I find onion for the first time. And I go and I dig it all up root and all so that I can tell which parts of this I can eat. Okay. And as I'm digging it all up, I'm going to cut little pieces of it off, right? I might take, a tiny, tiny little bit of root, and then I might take a tiny, tiny little bit of the bulb, and then I might take a tiny, tiny little bit of the leaf, right? And so in taking these three parts, I'm going to taste. I'm going to test. Now, when I put it to my mouth, does it burn? Am I getting any reaction initially? I'm not getting any. I'll be right back. I know that this has been frustrating for all of us. Apologize. I know that's frustrating for me and everybody else involved. It gets really frustrating to have to restart it several different times. And I apologize. I appreciate you guys waiting. I appreciate you guys being patient with YouTube or with TikTok. So I might take this, as I'm taking it, I might cut, the root and the bulb and the leaf of this onion that I've decided that I'm testing because it's the first time my community's come across it. So as I first put the root to my mouth and I'm first tasting the root, not the bulb, but the little spitally things that come off the root of the onion, right? The roots of it. I might put these up to my mouth. Now does this burn, right? What is my body's effect? Does my body change at all with this tiny little piece first put to my lips? I haven't ingested it yet. I've just put it up here, tasted it a little bit. What does it taste like? And does it burn? Does it taste like I'm hurting now? Most poisonous things will actually have an effect on the tongue. They'll either taste extremely bitter or they'll have like a burn or they'll have like a numbing effect, right? So am I getting any physiological changes just by tasting this little bit? And if I'm not, then I'm going to move to the next step of making sure that this is an okay substance. The first thing I'm probably going to do is I'm probably going to cook it. Just because by this point, I already know that I can digest cooked things faster than I can digest uncooked things. So I'll probably cook a little bit of it and see just a little taste, not a whole lot, just a millimeter of a taste to see, is this something that I can eat and live? Right? And then I'm going to wait a day before I'm going to go in and try the next piece of it. Now, maybe I try a bit of the leaf raw, right? And in trying a bit of that leaf raw, after I've ingested this tiny little bit, I'm waiting a full day to make sure. And so this is how we see Indigenous people across the globe moving into a new area, animals moving into a new area, anyone moving into a new area, how they're finding what's edible in that area and what's capable for helping them in that area. Okay. So we see that this happens no matter where you're moving across the globe, no matter what new space you're moving to. So by the time that Homo sapien is getting to Turtle Island in Abiyala, Homo sapien has been, living in Iraq for 100,000 years, and now they're moving out of Iraq, right? And they're moving across the lower portion of Asia because this is the part that's not under ice at this point of time. And then they're moving into the islands of the South Pacific, and they're moving on to Australia because this is what the DNA shows, and this is where we know people were at for an extended period of time in migration, right? And as they're moving through these spaces, as they move into places that have any other humans, anything underneath the genus Homo, so this would include human Neanderthal, Homo Neanderthal, human Denisovan, so Homo Denisovan. So as they're moving into these areas, any of the other humans that are in these areas are also going to teach them. As I'm moving through Borneo, I'm probably learning from Denisovan that poppy will be a great anesthetic anesthesic so that I can heal people with it, right? As I'm moving into Australia, now Homo sapien reached Australia at 70,000 years ago. The Indigenous Australians are the oldest Homo sapiens outside of Iraq, outside of the Arabian Peninsula, right? So they're the oldest group of Homo sapiens we find outside of that area. who have migrated into a space, and their civilization is roughly 70,000 years old. So as Homo sapiens are moving into Australia, before they hit the islands of the South Pacific, or after they hit a couple of the islands like Luzon, or not Luzon, Flores, you're seeing that the indigenous Homo sapiens that are already there, the indigenous Australians, are giving more information. Right? They're giving new thought process. This is an herb that will work really good for that. And wow, we really like this food, right? So then as they're moving through the islands of the South Pacific, at this time, I could not tell you really whether or not we have humans on those islands, but I will tell you that the likelihood is high. Why? Because by 100,000 years ago, we know that Homo luzonensis is on the island of Luzon in the Philippines. And by 100,000 years ago, we know that Homo florensis is on the island of Flores, right, in Indonesia. And so it is very likely that there are people on the islands in the South Pacific. A lot of times you'll hear scientists tell you that people have only been in the South Pacific for like 2,500 years. And the reason is because the islands that they're on have only been there for 2,500 years. We're talking about boat people move from island to island to island. Like one island goes, I'm going to move to the next one, right? So the islands themselves have only been there for 2,500 years, and that's why they rate different communities in the South Pacific as only having been in the South Pacific for that long, because they don't know islands where they've been there earlier, right? Because those islands have gone, those islands have sunk, which they do know that many islands have sunk. So as we're seeing, humans are moving across the South Pacific, and they're meeting different humans that are very likely already there. In the case of luzonensis in the Philippines, absolutely already there. We're seeing that as they get to each of these islands, or as they're going into each of these spaces, the humans that are already there are helping them understand the space, right? They're, showing them how to interact with the space, because as far as we know, every Homo species is eating the same things, right? We're seeing this, like Neanderthals were foodies. They made ovens and made flatbread and cooked crab. Like Neanderthals were badass foodies, right? And so we see that pretty much every knowledge that we have of any other Homo find that we have, they're eating the same foods as us, right? We share DNA with so many of them, right? That it makes a lot of sense that their nutrients are met by the same things. So we're probably getting information. As we get into North America and South America, Turtle Island and Abiyala, as sapien is arriving here, these finds that we're seeing here that are over 100,000 years old are all going to be finds from another species that's speciated from Homo erectus here. Homo erectus makes it across the globe. They make it to Australia. Before sapiens make it to Australia, there's a 120,000-year-old Moy site in Australia, and there's a ghost species in Indigenous Australians. There are 3 sites here that I've gone over. I've gone over 2 of them. I didn't go over yet the Cerruti Mastodon site, but we've gone over that one a few times, that are all demonstrative of Homo erectus making it here and speciating here and living here, right? So when sapiens is arriving in Abiyala is probably the most likely first place of arrival. When Homo sapiens are arriving there, they're meeting up with a species that is already here. Right? And they envelop that species within them. And as they envelop that species within them, which we can tell by the ghost species we see in indigenous Abiyalians and indigenous Turtle Islanders, as they're enveloping that species within them, they're picking up the knowledge from that species. What are the best plants in the area? What are the best foods in the area? How do you hunt in this area? How do you survive and thrive in this area? And so as people are moving into this area, again, already meeting up with a species that is already here and enveloping that species within them, a lot of their knowledge is coming from that. Any knowledge that they're not getting coming from that other species, or as they move into spaces that other species are not at, they're going to again apply that science of testing each and everything before they start utilizing it as a nutrient for their broader community. So the scientists within I don't know. I know that it starts in the 70s. And I know that it comes from a couple of books in the 70s, right? And from everything that I've seen, it really flows down from that racist rhetoric, that eugenics thought process, that kind of, and then, okay, so first let me state what the question was for those who can't see it. The question is, why do they think we're not indigenous to these lands? Who's responsible? And by that, I assume you mean the wannabe Aboriginals who are claiming that they are the people who are the indigenous people and we are not the indigenous people. Or that coppered-skinned people are not the indigenous people. Straight-haired, coarse-haired people are not the indigenous people. Native Americans, First Nations, Latino people are not. Latino people are not, and that might not be the correct term. It does change somewhat, and I apologize if I'm not the most correct in that. I'm not trying to offend, but there, that thought process that the people who are, by science and by everybody's knowledge, the indigenous people of this area are not somehow the indigenous people of this area. There's a couple of things with it, right? First of all, we have people writing books in the 70s, to my knowledge, right? And then we have the theory of race and the theory of eugenics. And the theory of race and the theory of eugenics and their concepts of who are here in Turtle Island, really Western science, white science, really doubles down on this idea that indigenous people haven't been here long enough to matter, right? You were only here recently, right? And so it doesn't matter. And so you see things like the Clovis first theories, right? And really that is, or like the thought process that Kennewick Man was actually European because of his craniology, which is one of those debunked sciences, right? We see there is this reason to discredit and discount, to kind of make it's like we didn't do something that bad. It wasn't that bad, right? It wasn't that bad. And that's really what it seems to be. And so we see that Europeans promote this ideology that we're a late arrival, because if they can promote this ideology, then that we're a late arrival, then it can, it makes them not look as bad, right? And in their promotion of this ideology of a late arrival, that's been co-opted by others, right? And again, it's really about trying to erase people. It's really about trying to justify atrocity, right? Make, the things I did not that bad, right? And I think that the people who are of African descent in the United States, who are trying to decide that they are the Aboriginal people here, right? The wannabe Aboriginal concept. Because of the things that I do in the communities that I move in, and because I'm very intersectional, I am aware that in 2020 in Portland, when we had really big gatherings of people trying to come together and talk about how we can make these changes, one of the overwhelming majority things that you see is that many people who are of African descent in the United States don't know their family history. It's in the way that the slave trade happened and in the way that these horrible things were done, they caused this vast disconnect. If I'm selling infants, they never know who their mother is. And where, as an Indigenous person, we can trace ourselves, my mother, my mother, my mother, my mother, my mother. My direct maternal line ends 5 generations ago. Her name was Lucy, and she escaped slavery pregnant with my grandma, Thalindra, and her son on her hip. That's my direct maternal ending, right? I can't go back any further than that because Lucy couldn't tell you who her mother was. And that's a huge trauma. And it's a completely different trauma than my Indigenous side, right? My Indigenous trauma is a completely different trauma than my Black trauma, right? And the Black trauma that I have in my family line is that it gets cut. We can't tell you. The DNA states it's the Sudan. We didn't really steal a lot of people from the Sudan, and the DNA only connects to modern day populations, right? So maybe my modern day cousins are in the Sudan, right? Doesn't tell me where Lucy was brought from. Doesn't even tell me who those cousins are, right? So there is a level of disconnect for African descendants, or the descendants of African slaves in this content, that is a higher level of disconnect than anybody else. And that was part of the purpose of the slave trade. They enslaved Native people first. When Europeans got here, they enslaved Indigenous people, but Indigenous people knew how to get up into the hills. They knew where to go. They were Indigenous. It was their land. So if I can bring somebody who doesn't know this land, they don't know where to run to. They don't know how to get away. And they don't know how to go home, right? So there is this level of disconnect, and I personally think that that is where that comes from. To me, it is a tragedy. It is sad, right? To me, it is this huge disconnect in this desperate search for something to connect, which I think that we all need to understand. That it's important that we understand as we have compassion and empathy, as we're trying to bring unity of marginalized voices so we can get rid of the thought process that's, harming us all, oppressing us all. As we're doing that, it's important to have this compassion and understanding of just how harmful that disconnect is, just how hurtful that disconnect is. And when that disconnect for so many people is literally 3 or 4 generations back, I mean, what do you do? How do you move forward from that, right? And, you don't want to go pan-African. You don't want to just adopt anything that's African, right? You want to find the direct connect, right? How do you find that direct connect, right? That's why I like that whole interaction with that large creator who, says that they're teaching the wannabe Aboriginals, that they're actually from Africa, them promoting they're getting a kickback. They're promoting a DNA test, right? By trying to tell people that they connect them back home. They're playing on that huge disconnect and that huge trauma. And it's really not something that we can tell. I can't tell your clan from your DNA. That's not possible. I can tell your mitochondrial DNA group, but I can't tell your people or your clan from your DNA that much, right? My DNA can connect me to the modern day Miwok people, but that doesn't mean that, that's not just modern day Miwok people with a mixture of European or African or Asian in them, right? It doesn't tell me that I'm Miwok, right? So when we're looking at that, for me, I think that that's important to understand, just because I think it deserves compassion and empathy, right? I try and enter into this concept as I'm trying to deal with and stop the erasure of this line. I have to remember the trauma of this line, right? And I think that it's really important to conceptualize that, right? Those of us who are Indigenous to Turtle Island or Yaba Yala, we'll say this frequently, we can trace our lines. I can trace back generation after generation after generation, right? That's a privilege. I stopped again, so you know why I went silent. I'm trying to go ahead and start it back up. Those of us who are Indigenous here, we can actually trace our line, right? We can trace our line back generation after generation, 500 or so years, right? If not more. It's important when we're looking at that, right? We don't got a lot of privileges, but that's a real privilege. It's a real privilege to know who your mother's 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 mother is, because there are others out there who will never be able to do that, right? Even if I can trace myself back to Lucy and then know that Lucy's, like, say Lucy actually came from the Sudan, right? Like her family actually came from the Sudan. Even if I can trace myself back to Lucy and know that maybe a few hundred years before her people were in the Sudan, I still can't find between Lucy and then. I still can't find, where Lucy, I can't even find Lucy's owner, right? Because my first find of Lucy is as an escaped slave. I know she escaped pregnant because that is our family history, right? That is what we have known for her child and her grandchild, right? So I know that, but I can't find the documentations. I can find Philinder's birth certificate, but I can't find the documentation of who owned Lucy, right? So it's really important as we're looking at this to understand that there's a beautiful privilege in being able to trace our ancestry, and not everybody has that privilege. It doesn't mean that they have the right to erase us, and it doesn't mean that they should be doing the things that they're doing, right? And it certainly should not be given a pass for white atrocity, right? But the understanding and the compassion, that's something that I was blessed to be able to hear, right? And I knew that feeling of disconnecting myself, but I also have other lines that I trace, right? And so hearing that and understanding that from people, we actually, there was a lot of people here who wanted to get together to be able to DNA test for people to try and at least find them the country within Africa that their people would have been from, right? Because of the fact that it is a desperate disconnect, right? It is a feeling of pain, and rightfully, validly so, right? So that's why, and that's where we see kind of the start of that Wabu ideology, right? That Wabu thought process. Returning it to, though, finding people arriving in Turtle Island and Abiyala, and how we're seeing migration. We talked before about a few of these things, and it's important to discuss them. It's important to look over what the modern science tells us, what the new science tells us, right? What it confirms, and how the DNA can trace movement. So the current knowledge is that at 54,000 years ago, there is a break within I've got a couple of sites here. Like I have the Topper site in South Carolina, which is 50,000 years ago. There is a Paiau site in Brazil that is 50,000 years ago, right? It's important to note when they talk about the 54,000 years ago, though, what they're talking about is a DNA split. And this would most likely be, I haven't read that article in a minute, so I have to go back and remember exactly which mtDNA, but I believe it is the XMT-DNA, because that split at 54,000 years ago is in Iraq. It is in the Middle East, in the Near East, right? The X1 mitochondrial DNA that is there, and then the X2 mitochondrial DNA that is here, and then X2A is here, and that is the initial split, right? So we see that these days when they're looking at DNA, they can actually trace generations in DNA, and they can trace generations back to the split of a mitochondrial line or a Y line, right? Because all of the lines are splits from a prior line, right? Nobody's line is the original line, even if you're Quay, even if you're in Australia, or not Australia, even if you're in Africa, the mitochondrial DNA is not going to be the original mitochondrial DNA, right? Because of the fact that the way mitochondrial DNA mixes and the way mitochondrial DNA plays out. Because when we're looking at DNA coming together, when a woman is passing on her DNA, she doesn't pass on her mother's X. She passes on a combination of her mother's X and her father's mother's X, right? Because the X that I have is my mother's X and my father's mother's X. I have Rebecca's X and Betty's X. And Betty's X and Rebecca's X was a pass on of the same thing. So it wasn't even my grandmother's X, right? And that's where we can see that new haplogroups come in, and where we can see that new lines are coming in, right? We know that most lines are dying out, right? That if you have the initial community of 30,000 or 30 people, an initial community of 30 people for Homo sapien, one of those lines, their genetics has continued. One person from 30, right? No, what it is this combination, right? So the split that they're talking about is the combination of the mitochondrial DNA, right? So the let's say we're looking at X1, okay? So X1's mitochondrial DNA is, probably a combination of I don't know what X is right before X. Anyway, so it's probably a combination of two different mitochondrial DNAs that come together, and those two different kind of mitochondrial DNAs coming together create a whole new mitochondrial line. We call these mitochondrial eaves. So a new mitochondrial eve might come about every 7,000 years or every 10,000 years. There was a book called The Daughters of Eve that really got into this, where it talks about how they can actually trace the mitochondrial eaves, right? And it actually goes into what the mitochondrial eaves are and when those mitochondrial eaves arose, at least in Europe. And what it talks about is, or what it's describing is the fact that I might have X1 DNA for 10,000 years, and then as that mitochondrial DNA is like morphing through each generation, because each generation that mitochondrial DNA is taking on a new X, like taking the father's mother's X, right, into it, right? And as that mitochondrial DNA is changing over the course of generations, we get to a point where all the other X line, X1 line is no longer continuing in this. Like you see that the X2 starts and goes from there. So it's really just about the way the mitochondrial DNA blends compared to the way we perceive it to blend. We tend to perceive it as you directly get your mom's and your dad's, right? But it's not that. It's you get your mom's combination of two, right? So a unique there. And then you get your dad's mother's, which is again a combination of two, right? And each line, or each generation back, is another combination of two. And so my X DNA, and then my X DNA, I'm going to pass down 3 completely different X's to each of my 3 children. My daughter gets her X from me and her X from her father's mother, right? Her father's mother's name is Charlene, right? So she gets my X and she gets Charlene's X. And Charlene's X comes from Reva. God, I don't remember Charlie's mother's name, but Charlene's X is half Reva and half Charlie's mother. And half Reva and half Charlie's mother forms a Charlene, right? And when Charlene passes that DNA, her X, down to my daughter's father passes that X entirely down. He's the only one that will pass it entirely down. Males actually pass the entire X or the entire Y down. There is not a split in reconfiguration within the male itself, right? It is within the females that the reconfiguration happens. And that's why within Y DNA, we can actually trace family lines within Y DNA, but we cannot trace family lines within X DNA. So the combination that my daughter has is I took my mother's, Rebecca's X, and I took Betty's X. And maybe I've got the right lower leg of the X and the left upper arm of the X. This is what I passed down, right? And that's from that's my mom, right? From my dad's mom, maybe I also pass down the left upper side and the right lower side, right? So maybe I pass down the same branches from both X's. Now my daughter is still going to have a full X, right? It's still going to have a right and a left, right? Yet my son, my firstborn son, maybe for him, I gave him the left lower, side and the right upper side from one, and the left upper side and the right lower side from the other. So his X has a full branch from each, right? And of course, that's really simplifying it, right? Um, so his X that he's going to pass on is going to be that full X. It's the combination of the two. But my daughter's X, she's going to take Charlene's X that Charlene passed to Jim, and she's going to take my X that is a combination of my mother and my father's mothers and pass that down to her child. So it's not going to be my full X. It's not going to be your father's full X. It's going to be a combination of the two. And literally, it's like very oversimplifying it, right? Because like, there's like so many different genomes within it, and like if it's 30,000 genomes, I might take like 1 through 15,000 here, but I might take 1 and 5 and 10 and 6 and 4 and 3 and right from the other one, right? It's never as straightforward as just an arm and a leg, right? It keeps doing this where it detects inactivity for me, and I don't know why it's detecting inactivity for me. I'm wondering, I'll try and turn that on and see if it helps at all. So within that, it is, that's why we can't really like trace a family line through an X DNA, right? I can't tell you your mother's 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 mother so much. I can tell you a community. The division and how they trace generations back, I could not even begin to explain to you how they trace the generations back. Like I know that they can. I don't know how, right? I don't know how they determined that. Also, like I know that they can pull out your skin color and eye color and things like that from DNA now, from the different alleles, and they can actually, like the picture I have of Denny is supposed to be what Denny actually looks like from what they determined from the DNA, which I have no clue how they determined what Denny looks like from her DNA. It's some new testings and some new evaluations they're doing, right? But that split from X1 to X2 happens at 54,000 years ago. X1 is currently in the Levant and in Iraq, right? So it happens in those spaces, and we know that 50,000 years ago, that's where we're at, right? So 54,000 years ago, that split happens, and when that split happens, what happens is we have people starting to move across, right? We have, and most communities in a early time period are going to be roughly 30 to 60 people. If you get above that, it's really hard to maintain, right? If you get below that, it's really hard to provide. So you're going to have between 30 and 60 people for your community. So we're going to call this initial community that's moving out X, okay? So community X at 54,000 years ago says goodbye, and they leave Iraq, right? We're going to assume Iraq right now because we know that we're living there until 50,000 years ago. So 54,000 years ago, that's probably where we're leaving from. If you're looking at a map of Western and Eastern Eurasia, what we're seeing is at this time, ice is covering a good portion of it. This is why Neanderthal is down there with us, because ice has been covering their home. So we are moving across a lower portion of Eastern Eurasia. Think India, think Turkey, right? We're moving along that lower edge because this is a swath that's open. Now, as we're moving along, and I want to make sure that I'm getting this as clear as possible because frequently this gets twisted. If I move with my people and say we move 100 miles and we decide that we're going to stay in this new space, this is my entire community. I have, say, 50 people in my community. Me and my 50 people of community X are staying in, this is a little bit far, but just because I know it on a map, say we're in Hindu, in northern India, in the Hindu mountains, right? We've moved along and we're staying in this space. And again, my geography is horrible. So if I fucked that one up, I apologize. Right? So community X at 50 people is staying in this space. We've gotten here. We're going to stay here for a while, right? We've been wandering for a bit and we want to stay. And so we stay. Now there's Denisovan in this area, most likely, right? So we're mixing with the Denisovan and we're interacting with the Denisovan and we're talking with the Denisovan. And maybe we stay there for 4 or 5 generations, right? And as we're staying in this space in 4 or 5 generations, the only other humans in this space are other genus Homo non-sapien species, right? So you're going to see that Denisovan is in this space. We might see that there's other species that we don't know of. There's a ghost species in Denisovan and Neanderthal DNA, right? Maybe Florensis is all over, not just in the island of Flores. Who the fuck knows, right? But there are no Homo sapiens in this area. There is just our community of Homo sapiens. We stay for a few generations in this space, right? And as we're staying for a few generations in this space, we're burying our dead, right? When we decide it's time to move on, our entire community picks up. Our entire community is moving along. Maybe by this time we've grown to 60 people. We're reaching kind of the top edge of what we really want in a community anyways. And, we kind of need new space. So we start moving on. And maybe over the course of the next, generation or two, even, we're moving. We're not staying in one space at any point of time. We're moving, right? We're not leaving 10 people behind. Our entire community is necessary for us to survive. So we're bringing our entire community with us. We are leaving behind our dead. We're not leaving behind our people. We're not leaving behind our sister. We're not leaving behind our brother. We're bringing our entire community with us. And as we're moving along this space and bringing our entire community with us, and again, this movement may be over a couple of generations. We may actually have a few generations where we're completely migratory, right? We might have a few generations where we're completely migratory, and then a few generations where we stay in one space and we live in that space. And then we pick everybody up and we move along. And as we're doing this, because we're intermixing with the other species of Homo that are in that space, we're getting some of that Denisovan gene within us. We then end up moving down into the southeastern portion of Asia, down into the islands of the South Pacific. We know now that Homo erectus crossed water because Homo erectus it's just so frustrating, and I just don't know what to do with it. We now know that Homo erectus crossed water, and we know that Neanderthal crossed water. How do we know that erectus crossed water? We know that erectus crossed water, again, the Moy site that we see in Australia. The island of Indonesia has never been attached to land, and the island of Flores has never been attached to Asia. The island of Indonesia is in the Wallace Trench, and the Wallace Trench has always been this extremely deep trench between two continents, and it's never been above sea level. So no matter how far the seas have gone down, the island of Indonesia, or the island of Flores in Indonesia, has never been connected to land. And the same thing with the island of Luzon, because it's below the Wallace Trench. So we know that both of these spaces mean that they crossed water. We also know from the 120,000-year-old Moy Hill site in Australia that they crossed water. And at 70,000 years ago, we know Homo sapien is crossing water because they are already in Australia. So by 54,000 years ago, when we're starting to move across, and again, maybe it takes us 1,000 years to get from Iraq to Australia, right? Maybe that's an 1,000-year journey across the lower eastern, southeastern portion of Eurasia, right? Maybe that's a 1,000-year journey. Again, we might spend a couple generations on the move, and we might spend a couple generations in space, staying in space, right? And those couple generations staying in space might be, we might be leaving our dead behind, but we're not leaving our people behind when we decide to move on. Now, there is, as we're starting to populate regions, a different way of doing this. When you are populating a region and when you are staying in a region, when your community gets too large, a group will split off and move into another area or form a new community. But this is populating a region and staying in a region. It's not moving through a region. When you're moving through a region, your entire community is going with you. So we're seeing, say it's 1,000 years and then they get to Australia. Now, why am I saying that? because we know that like Denisovan DNA is seen the most in Australia and in Papua New Guinean people. So that tells us that we probably get most of our Denisovan DNA from Australian and Papua New Guinean people, right? So, and here in Turtle Island Indigenous people have 0.02 to 0.03% Denisovan DNA. And this gives us, it is believed, a 10,000 year timeline of intermixing with the Denisovan. So maybe we're spending 5,000 years with the Denisovan in Southeast Asia and 5,000 years with the Denisovan in Australia, right? But we are moving across, and we're moving across with our whole community. And as we're moving into Australia, into the islands of the South Pacific, we're interacting with people there. We actually do pick up some DNA from them, right? And we are also picking up the Denisovan DNA at the time. We know that by 50,000 years ago, we see some sapient finds, right? So by 50,000 years ago, we're probably starting to see people make it here. Maybe Denisovan came over here with us for a little while. You know, maybe we had a few Denisovan people that came with us, and that's how we have that much Denisovan DNA. Maybe we have an outlier group that comes a little bit earlier, right? Maybe some of the 50,000-year-old finds aren't actually sapient finds. Maybe they actually have to do with the other ghost species that we have, right? So, but we do see sites like in Carolina at 50,000 years ago, right? And we do see sites at 38,000 years ago in Mexico. So, as we're seeing this, it's currently being investigated and proposed and theorized between the cut in the DNA and between the between the cut in the DNA and where we see Denisovan DNA. It's being theorized that there is a southern boat route. Now, again, this is where Western science is starting to confirm indigenous knowledge, right? Do I think that the earliest ancient Egyptians were sub-Saharan type Africans? Well, I would assume that the earliest ancient Egyptians were North Africans, because Egypt is North Africa, not sub-Saharan, right? And I am not sure, like, are you defining sub-Saharan just as like dark skin and tightly coiled hair, right? Or where's the distinction on that, right? I would guarantee you that ancient Egyptians were Africans, 100%. It is not until roughly 1000 BCE that we start seeing, maybe it's 1700 BCE, that we start seeing invasions from outside spaces in the Levant area and in the Arabian Peninsula that are coming in first and taking over the kingship, pharaohship within ancient Egypt, that we start to see the influx of ruling classes from outside of Africa. North Africans, of course, if you were going to give them a title on the taxonomy scale of race, are Caucasian, because that is the area where Caucasian is attributed to, right? Caucasian absolutely means brown. So when we're seeing that movement over and that timeline between the DNA cutoff, right? That timeline within the generations with the DNA, and when we're seeing the way that we see the intermixed Denisovan DNA, it's absolutely telling us. I'd love to see that article. If you could, on one of my videos, tell me the name of the article or something like that. There's like a pinned video that has questions. You know, what do you want me to talk about? If you could tell me that article, because I haven't read that. It'd be cool to read. So because of where the Denisovan DNA is and because of that cut, it's now being looked at that southern boat route. And that southern boat route, of course, is something that Turtle Island Indigenous people, Abiyalian Indigenous people have been saying for ever, right? There are many, many stories that talk about coming over here on boats, and many of these stories are not the Kelp Highway stories. They're definitely stories of the South Pacific, right? And so this definitely gives confirmation to many of the migration stories that we have from Turtle Island Indigenous and Abayalian Indigenous people. So this is one of those beautiful places where Western science is finally starting to really look into that. I'm going to turn this off and turn this back on because it's gone down a couple of times, and I think that we've kind of like, I don't think it's up anymore. Like, I think it's having problems. So I'll be back in 5 minutes tops on TikTok because I'm going to end live and restart the live. Sure, over here. Sorry, I really wasn't reading over here. I apologize. I wasn't reading over here because I have that website up over there on TikTok or on YouTube. I'm like staring at that website as I'm talking, which is horrific of me. I apologize. So I'm now looking at the website or at where it is, where you guys are able to talk. Thank you for talking over there. It's always awesome when people are talking over on YouTube. I never expect it. So I don't tend to look over on YouTube because I never expect people to be talking over there. So I did just restart the live. Hopefully the restarting will put it back where we need it to be because it is being a little bit of an issue today. I'm really not sure. I mean, it has been a little bit of an issue frequently lately, so I'm sure it's being a little bit of an issue just because it's frequently an issue these days. But it does seem like it's absolutely up again. Love you too, baby. It's absolutely like being able to be seen. You're not going to see that dog. You're just not. You're staying here with your mama. You're fine. You stay here with your mama. Yeah, you got your toy. Your toy. Well, she's locked in her room, so you can go there, but you can't have her. We were just talking about how the DNA split and the DNA that we see in Turtle Island Indigenous people and in Abayalian Indigenous people shows us a southern migration route and shows us when and where the first people are making it to Turtle Island and Abayala. And so, as we're talking about the first people making it to Turtle Island and Abayala, we're seeing that the Denisovan DNA in Turtle Island Indigenous people and Abayalian Indigenous people indicates that it is a southern boat route because that's where we see Denisovan DNA and where we see Abayalian DNA, or Denisovan DNA in Turtle Island Indigenous people. Sorry, got distracted. Background. We see Denisovan DNA in modern populations in Southeast Asia, in the islands of the South Pacific, and in Australia. And so this tells us that the first migrations over here that are picking up that Denisovan DNA are picking up that Denisovan DNA from a southern migration in this southern boat route. And seeing that a first migration over here, the DNA split from X1 to X2 happens at 54,000 years ago of mitochondrial DNA shows us that that split happening at 54,000 years ago actually happens in the Near East or the Middle East, which is where we are living at the time with Neanderthal. And so we see that DNA split at 54,000 years ago also really helps put together that conversation about the southern boat route. Because when we're looking at, yay, it was not working right. When we're looking at the way that southern, when we're looking at where the ice is at the time, what is, yeah, and that's what it is. It's not so much, some of the sea levels are different. Like at this point, the Arabian Peninsula and Africa aren't really disconnected. Like they're the same continent, right? And that enters into a lot. It also enters into the fact that ice is covering the vast majority of the northern half of Eurasia. And so when we're seeing people moving across, they're moving across the lower portions of Eurasia because it's the only thing that's out from underneath the ice, the only thing that's able to be moved across, right? And so again, as we were talking, you're not seeing people moving into an area and growing this really large community and then breaking off, and that is who's moving. What you see is you're moving your entire community. Most of these early communities, again, are between 30 and 60 people. So if your community of 50 people is moving, now you might move for a couple of generations. You might be migrating for a couple of generations where you're not staying in one place. So say you migrate for 200 years as you're moving, right? That's a couple of generations. It's roughly about 8 generations today. So say you're migrating for 200 years, and then you find a place and you stay in that place for, say, 1,000 years even, right? And staying in that place for 1,000 years, you've Denisovan there. There's likely to be Neanderthal there. There are other groups of humans. There are not other sapiens there because you are the first group of sapien who is leaving Africa at this time, who is moving over. Of course, let me correct that. You are not the first group because the first group is Indigenous Australians coming out at 70,000 years ago. So it's already been done, but there are not people living in Eastern Eurasia at this time. Homo sapien is not in Eastern Eurasia at this time, Southeastern Eurasia at this time. Denisovan is in Southeastern Eurasia at this time. So as you're moving through Southeast Eurasia, you're meeting up with the Denisovan. You're getting a lot of DNA from the Denisovan people, right? As you maybe migrate for 8 generations, a couple hundred years, and then maybe stay in a space for 100 generations, let's say 2,500 years, which is 100 generations currently, right? So maybe you stay in northern India for 100 generations. You leave behind your dead, but your group is not getting larger. Like you are staying somewhat stable in group size, right? Because once you get too high in group numbers, it becomes unwieldy. And if you get too low in group numbers, you don't have enough people to provide nutrient for everybody and nurture for everybody, right? So you have to have a stable community. Maybe you get up to a couple of hundred members of your community. When you decide that this space, what or one will smack your little ass. YouTube, give me a second. I'll be right back. My boss is being a jerk because there's an in-heat email and let me prove my point everywhere, right? So as we are seeing people becoming new groups, we might see that this new group I am semi-back, though TikTok dropped me. 1 second. YouTube will be right there. I apologize. It's getting a little frustrating. Not exactly sure what the heck is going on right now, right? Not exactly sure why this just doesn't work as well right now. So as we're seeing that movement, as we're seeing that space, people coming into Turtle Island and Abiyala, as they're coming into Turtle Island and Abiyala, are meeting up with the Homo erectus descendant species that's here, getting that DNA, that ghost species DNA that we see in Turtle Island Indigenous people and Abiyalian Indigenous people. And again, they did not leave anybody behind. They're taking their entire community with them. We do not see Southeast Asia populated until after this, right? Southeast Asia gets populated after Indigenous people who end up in Turtle Island and Abiyala have already moved through that space. They don't leave people behind. That is not who becomes Asian. I'm going to go ahead and open it up for any questions with it, just because that's kind of the vast majority of what I kind of really wanted to go over is that migration pattern, right? And what we're seeing with that. Well, you are the one that stated that you read that somewhere. I'd love, like I told you, to find where you read that so that I could find the information, because I had not heard that yet. So if you found new information that Denisova is taller than us, then I would love if you would comment that somewhere that actually, like, I can find an article to source it and read it and find out if that information is factual, because I haven't seen that. Hi, Sari. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Welcome. So as we are, let me go ahead again and let me open that up for questions. We've just gone over, we've gone over a lot. We've gone over how long ago people are starting to leave the Arabian Peninsula. The Levant area and the Arabian Peninsula is where people are actually leaving to migrate from. And we've gone over where we're seeing that, how we're seeing that between the DNA split, between finds that we have, and between other DNA within peoples. So we went over a lot with that. And then we talked about some of the oldest finds here in Turtle Island and Abiyala. Some of the oldest finds here in Turtle Island and Abiyala are 200,000 years old, right? We have sites here in Turtle Island and Abiyala that predate Homo sapiens' existence, which is indicative of Homo erectus having made it here and created a species here, speciating here, that Turtle Island Indigenous people and Abiyalian Indigenous people actually enveloped in them when they arrived as Homo sapiens later on, which is where we get a ghost species DNA within Turtle Island Indigenous people and Abiyalian Indigenous people. Okay, this is, again, we see that Western science is really starting to confirm a lot of Turtle Island Indigenous science and Abiyalian Indigenous science, right? And one of the sciences that it is confirming is the idea of us speciating here, of Indigenous people being created here. So if we have a ghost species that was created here, right? Homo erectus makes it to Turtle Island and Homo erectus makes it to Abiyala. They speciate in Turtle Island and Abiyala. Speciating is being created here. One here. There is 7 ghost species that we've found so far. 3 ghost species in the Kwe people and the Yoruba people in Africa. Those are also the only 2 communities in Africa, in the world, that don't have Neanderthal. The rest of Africa has Neanderthal prior to colonization, and everywhere else across the globe has Neanderthal prior to colonization, except for, again, the Kwe people and the Yoruba people. And I said Yoruba first. I'm trying to change the way I'm pronouncing Yoruba. Within those, we have 3 ghost species. We also see within Neanderthal and Denisovan that there's a ghost species that we don't see in us. We see Indigenous Australians have a ghost species, and we see that Turtle Island Indigenous people and Aboriginal Indigenous people have a ghost species. And then the 7th one, I believe, is in Asia. It's a recent one, and I haven't gotten all the details yet, right? Absolutely. There's quite a few. You're probably thinking the Cerruti Mastodon site, right? That's not even our earliest. That one's 130,000 years ago. Calico Hill in California is 200,000 years ago. And the Hell Loco site has 3 different datings. One of them is 800,000 years ago, and one of them is 250,000 years ago, and then one of them is 40,000 years ago, all of which predates current thought process, right? All of those are actually on my website underneath Rewriting the Western Hemisphere. You'll see pre-sapien finds and post-sapiens finds. Those findings are actually pretty old. Like those are from the 60s. You're talking about Cerruti Mastodon. It's an amazing site. I love that. That is also on there. I'm really fascinated by Calico Hill because Calico Hill was worked on by Louis Leakey and actually dated by Louis Leakey, who is one of like the foundational archaeologists, right? And not the Cerruti Mastodon one. It's a new Mastodon site though. Do you have a name on it? 2 months ago. Right the fuck on. That's amazing. Arrow, do you know a name on it? All I'm being able to pull up is the Cerruti site, which is also in San Diego, but that one was published a while ago. Yeah, all I'm seeing is the Cerruti one. Instead in carbon dated, and it's San Bernardino. That's it. I'm going to continue to look and see if I can find that. If you know an article or anything like that, like if you have something direct, yeah, absolutely. No, totally understand that. If you have like a title of an article, if you could put that on one of my videos, I can then pull it up and try and see if I can find more out on it because that's amazing. I am so down, and I'll add it to my list of rewriting, like really, there's so many different things that Western science is really confirming in Indigenous science today. And I really like to bring as much possible forward as I can where we have some Western science confirmation, just because Western science only accepts their own confirmation, right? And so I really feel it's like arrows in our quiver, like the ability to go, wait a minute, but you said, we know, but you said, right? That's amazing. That's amazing. Yeah, there's starting to really see, like there's a lot of new discoveries that they're really starting to go, oh, that's not what we thought. That's something completely fucking different. That's really friggin' amazing. That makes me so happy. Thank you for bringing me that information. Oh, I can't wait. Oh, I can't wait to see how that plays. Like, oh, yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing. That's amazing. Oh, thank you. I'm so appreciative of that information, Flying Arrow. That is a beautiful information. Thank you so much. That will give so much weight right, for so many people, give so much information for so many people. Again, I want to state it should not take Western science confirming things for us to know, right? Indigenous science is indigenous science. It's been going on for millennia. It did not get cut off like Western science did. It should be respected. It should be acknowledged. And when indigenous scientists tell you that we have been here this long, that this is what happened, that should be respected and understood without having to have Western science's confirmation. It is still very amazing when we do get Western science's confirmation. Not to be rude, sometimes it feels like an in your face, though, like, ha, 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 told you so. And so I really like those, the ability to have the, yes, see, you said it, see, right? So I really appreciate that. That's amazing. Thank you. When we are looking at the sites like that, right, what this again tells us isn't necessarily sapien being here. It's another speciesing from Homo erectus here. Now, I personally think this is our giants. That is not something that you're going to find somebody in science agreeing with me on. Okay. Yet, of the purported 27 giant skeletons that have been found through the course of history, because finding giant skeletons actually goes as far back as Greece, right? That's awesome. So, of the 27 purported giant skeleton finds that we have throughout history, almost all of them are here. Like of the 27, I think 20 are here in North America. And we have something called island giganticism and island dwarfism. And what island giganticism and island dwarfism says is that depending on the space, the amount of predators, and the amount of nutrients, you will either grow or shrink. And we see that this happens in humans because we see that Homo florensis shrunk. Homo florensis is about 3'5" at its height, like the tallest of them, and they have large feet, right? That's that ghost species. That's that ghost species. Right there on the nose, that's that ghost species. And when we are looking at why Homo florensis shrunk because of island dwarfism. Island dwarfism states that if you're in a small space and you have few predators or no predators, and you have a lower ability to get nutrition, like there's not a lot of nutritional elements around you, then you will shrink to fit the space and to fit the nutrient values so that you can actually have people. If you are in a space that is large, that has a high number of large predators in it, and has a high nutrient quality, right? A high presence of nutrients in it, then you will grow to fit the space. Thank you so much. And so with island giganticism and island dwarfism, we absolutely see that in North America alone, most of our massive species are here. The giant sloths, the mastodons, things like that are mostly coming in this space. And they're coming in this space because you have a large space with large nutrient amounts within it and a large number of large predators. Some of those predators are actually growing to fit the space, right? The supernumerary? Huh. I'm going to look into that a little bit more. That's pretty cool. So with that, it's a supernumerary teeth. It's the excess number of teeth. You're supposed to have 32 teeth. And so supernumerary teeth are having, like, if you have like another tooth that grows out here, or you maybe have too many more molars, right? That's supernumerary. The tight, you know, people who have their teeth are too close together and they're kind of overlapping. A lot of times that comes from having a supernumerary teeth, having supernumerary teeth, because there's more teeth in your mouth than your mouth's supposed to fit, right? And so they'll bunch up together, which is absolutely something you see a lot in Turtle Island Indigenous people. It's actually part of why we have this. They're kind of like, they're called wing teeth, I think, if I remember correctly. Our bottom two teeth will frequently kind of like go in like this, like they'll make a V in. I have one, not both, but one is slight and then the other one is pretty big. I have it where they kind of V in. And that's one of those things that actually attributes to, I don't have supernumerary, but a lot of times having supernumerary will bunch your teeth a little bit, right? That's pretty cool. So let me trace back. So when we look at island dwarfism and island giganticism, it makes perfect sense along those lines that Homo erectus species that speciates here is going to speciate as giants, is going to speciate large. Everything else is speciating large here because there's large predators, because there's vast land, and because there's a lot of nutrient here. There's a lot of nutrient value. So I personally believe, when I think of it, it's Homo giganticus to me. Like that's our giant Homo species, right? Like, so this would be the ghost species. Actually, I really don't want to butcher, and I'm sorry, but Yinshin was talking about having the extra genes, right? The genes that they couldn't place, and that's that ghost species. So when we see genes that we can't place anywhere else, we know that this is a ghost species because there are genes that Inchin, thank you. I appreciate that. I really hate butchering people's names. It's like one of those things I really don't like to do, so I appreciate that. Inchin. So what Inchin was talking about was having, I think they said 13%, right? Or 13 something. Let me double check. Unknown, 13% unknown hominid autosomal DNA and 50 unrecognized alleles. So this here means that they have one of the ghost species within them. And I'm going to assume by your name that it is your Turtle Island or Abiyalian indigenous, right? So this would be the Turtle Island or Abiyalian indigenous ghost species, right? Which is a really beautiful thing to be able to find looking in your DNA, right? That's fascinating, right? So when we're looking at that, again, I want to point out that this really confirms a lot of indigenous tradition here, a lot of indigenous science here. There's many nations in Turtle Island and Abiyala whose science talks about being created here. So when somebody is being created in a space, that is speciating this space. So if Homo erectus is here, speciating here, this is being created here. Refrozen over there, YouTube, just so you know. I'll be back. I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. We're just going to restart it. Absolutely and completely, hopefully. Because if we can restart it, it might just reset it because it keeps giving me problems. And I'm hoping if I reset it that maybe it will give me a little less problems for just a minute. I'm going to give it just a minute because it takes people a couple minutes to get back in as it crashes down on us and we come back. We've been going at this for like 2 hours and it's probably crashed on us like 5 or 6 times in the 2 hours we've been doing this. So I'm giving it a minute for people to make it back in. We have been doing this a lot lately. It has been crashing on us a lot lately. And so I'm going to go ahead and give it a couple minutes for people to make it back into the live since it crashed out yet again on me. Did it automatically? Hi, beautiful. I don't know what happened. on, lovely? I can't even hear. Hold on. There we go. Now I can hear you. I didn't even have my volume up. Welcome, welcome. We don't know how. I can tell by her face. She has no fucking clue what we just did.
I was hitting the like button on it. I was just, and then I said you invited, and I was like, okay. I'll drop down.
No, you're fine. I mean, yes, but you did do anything wrong. I don't know. It was probably as I'm trying to scroll through that it hit that, and I apologize. Not that you are not welcome up on my panel. Just that I have no clue why. It was shocking. So, when we're looking at that, and thank you so much, Levity. When we're looking at that, it's now I'm totally sideways. Give me about 2 seconds to kind of refirm myself and put myself back in my space. If you do not follow and know that individual that was up, this is an amazingly beautiful Indigenous sibling who actually goes out and teaches and educates people so that people can actually understand how to, not appropriate culture, and also so that people can understand how to, connect a little bit more and to understand culture a little bit more, right? So if you are not following Amaluk, you should absolutely follow her. She is an amazing human being, and I absolutely adore her. So when we are looking at that speciation of Homo erectus here in Turtle Island and here in Abiyala, many Indigenous science and historians and knowledges will tell you that their nation speciated here. So when Homo sapiens is arriving, right, and Homo sapiens is finding the species that has speciated here and enveloping them within them, right, that is speciating here, right? They're becoming a part of the species that speciated here. So they're carrying the knowledge that the species that speciates here. And again, I kind of think of them as Homo giganticus. They're carrying their knowledge into their nation. They're carrying their history and their science into their nation. And so it is absolutely 100% them speciating here, right? Whereas the sapien part of them may have speciated in Africa. The rest of them either speciated in Asia from Denisova, right, or speciated here, right? And so that is absolutely a confirmation of Indigenous science and Indigenous knowledge. And again, so frequently now we're seeing where Western science is confirming Indigenous science, right? That makes sense, though, right? I mean, when we look at many, in my traditions, the animals are often just other peoples, right? They're other nations, right? You might have, the wolf nation, right? Or the buffalo nation, right? There are other nations of animals, right? So it makes total sense to me that hairless people are a new type of people if everybody's people. Though I'm not stating that that is what your nation takes that as or is teaching that as, right? It might be something completely different, and I'm not trying to overspeak your nation's traditions or teachings, right? That's kind of cool. That's beautiful. That's kind of cool. That actually, that kind of really kind of confirms, though, right? I mean, we don't know we don't even know if Homo erectus was hairy, right? We don't. We've decided, right? We believe that Homo erectus had lost their hair because of the fact that body lice. We believe that Homo erectus is the first to develop body lice. Body lice comes when you've lost your body hair, but you're wearing clothing, right? And that's how you get body lice, because it is a speciation from hair lice, right? And so we believe that Homo erectus by at least, I think they want to say, I want to say off the top of my head, by 1,000,000 years ago, we're thinking that they, have lost their hair. But, we don't know for certain because we don't have DNA from Homo erectus. We've never gotten DNA from them, so we can't really tell. I did not know that. That's actually kind of cool. Beautiful nation, by the way. I actually grew up in coastal Salish territory and have spent most of my life in coastal Salish territory. I am too, but I try not to like totally down for being told things. I'm not gonna like. I try not to share them or I don't usually encourage other people to share more than they're like in a public space. Like sit down and talk to me about it, but I don't typically. I mean, and I'm not stopping anybody. Anybody can share whatever the heck they want. I just also want to try and make sure that I'm always respectful, that I'm not trying to get people to actually, share things that are not shareable, right? So, that's cool. Yeah. Well, and I like hearing, I just, I guess I get really worried and careful. Like Amaluk and I were talking last night, and Amaluk was giving me information about some different things. And well, it was, or maybe it was today. And well, I'm working on something specifically, and I'm going to talk about the something specific that I talked about. And I will mention, because it is knowledge that I saw elsewhere, that the thing that I'm talking about isn't only within these specific peoples, but you can also see it within these peoples as well. But I'm still not going to give details of what you see within these peoples because it's not my details to share, right? So I personally try and be really careful about what I share in public, or what, I ask to be shared in public, right? Just because I would like to make sure that people aren't, there's so much stuff is kept by culture keepers, because if it's not, then it gets twisted or screwed up, or things like that. What was the most annoying thing you've ever said ever? Oh, you've ever heard say ever? Well, you can go ahead and scroll on. If I'm annoying you, you don't have to be here, right? Why would you have to be here? Nobody's forcing you. If I annoy you, if my voice annoys you, if my topic annoys you, it's a really cool thing that we have called autonomy. And especially in things like TikTok and social media, you have this thing, you have this thumb, and you just go, and it's gone. Autonomy is amazing. And technology's ability to get rid of what you don't fucking want to hear is amazing. So if my voice annoys you, or my topic annoys you, or the way that I phrase things annoy you, scroll, dude, scroll. Have fun with it. Find something that's a little less annoying. Because if I'm annoying to you, then you're never going to get what I'm sharing with you. You're never going to hear me, right? My voice annoys you. You can't hear or take in what I'm saying. So find someone who can teach you in a way that is healthy for you, right? We are at 2 hours, though. And I have tried to kind of put a boundary of keeping myself at 2 hours. I did go for 3 the other day, but that's because it was actually working, right? So I'm going to go ahead and close out. If you're new, this will be new for you. I didn't really go into this today because we were talking about migration, and we were talking about how we see Indigenous peoples making it across the globe, or making it to Abiyala and Turtle Island. But it's important for me to let you know a couple of things. And this whole live is over on YouTube, as are my other lives. So you can go over there and you can see them if you missed any of this, especially because it's spotty back and forth in TikTok right now, right? And they're all there so you can listen to them. And so you can find some of this information. And I repeat this at the end of every one of my lives, so you can hear it a few different times in a few different ways. Biologically, we are nurturing and communal. Why do I say that? Well, biologically, we are the only species out there that has what we call mandatory midwifery. One other species had this. This was Homo neanderthal, but we're currently the only one that's that has this. Mandatory midwifery means we must have somebody help us give birth. The way that our pelvic outlet is shaped, the way that our head is shaped, and the way that our shoulders are shaped means that we have to turn our children twice as they're coming through the birth canal. So we have to have help to do that. Now, don't get me wrong. Absolutely, there are women out there who have a larger birth canal and give birth to smaller children. There are women out there like myself who are extremely flexible and can reach up inside themselves if need be, right? Even very pregnant, though, it would still be very hard to reach up inside, right? So there's absolutely the ability for people to absolutely be the exception to this rule. But the rule is mandatory midwifery, which means we have to have somebody help us give birth. This means we have to have community to give birth. We have to have somebody who knows how to pull a baby out of our body to help us give birth. This is a need of community. We also have 5 life stages or brain stages of growth from neonate to adult. Of every other species on this planet, including Neanderthal, nobody has ever had as many life stages as we do. These life stages are what give us the malleability in our brain and what give us the ability to understand things in the way that we do. Because, are we still frozen? Are we here? Okay, cool beans. Okay, so we have 5 life stages from neonate to adult. Neanderthals had 4 life stages, but we're the only ones that have ever had 5 life stages. So from firstborn to like 2 is a stage of brain development, right? And during that time, we're taking in so much information. All of this information is given to us through nurture. We also did studies in the 50s, the failure to thrive studies that you will have seen in the 50s. And the failure to thrive studies taught us that if you do not give an infant touch and care, that infant will not thrive and they will in fact die, right? So we must have nurturing from neonate to full brain development, which is currently 25 years. The longest of any species on the planet. This is something where we must have multiple people care for us. Why do I say multiple people care for us? Because even today, if you are a single parent, there are still multiple adults who are required to care for your child. School teachers, daycare workers, your boss, your coworkers, the grocery store attendee, the farmer that farms your food, that puts it on a truck so a truck driver can take it to the grocery store so somebody can stock it on a shelf so that the grocery store attendee can sell it to you. Even today, we still have multiple stages. No one can take a screaming, crying infant and go out hunting. You're not going to get anything, okay? And if you take them out gathering, you might attract a few bears, right? You're not going to be able to actually provide solely for an infant on yourself or for any child. We have to have community. And current studies actually have proven to us that to raise a child takes a community of roughly 30 people to raise a single child from neonate to adult, right? So we are biologically nurturing and communal as a species. These are things that we have to have. And we live in a society that tells us that these things aren't right? Don't feed the homeless, you're going to get arrested. Why should you care for your next door neighbor? They're a different color, so they must be trying to kill you, because it's not really the people on top who are trying to kill you. Love is beating your child. Like, we live in a society that teaches us that hate is love and love is hate. And we live in a series of disconnect. We live in a 2-parent home 9 times out of 10, which is extremely unhealthy and has everything to do with housing and landlords trying to make a big buck, right? Instead of having multiple generations living in one home. If I can convince you that every mother and father need to have their own home, right? And everybody needs 2,500 square feet to raise a child, right? We are currently living in a society that teaches us disconnect. It teaches us to not have empathy. Well, it's telling us it's teaching us empathy. So your brain tells you something's wrong. Many of us believe that there's a problem, and many times we'll internalize that as us being the problem. And many of us are depressed, and many of us are anxious. Many of us feel disconnected, and we don't understand why. This is a healthy response to an unhealthy society. Violence, hierarchy, all of these things, these are 10,000 years old. This is not natural for you. This is, in fact, extremely unnatural for you. And because of the fact that these things are extremely unnatural for you, so many of us are dealing with pain and depression and anxiety and feeling like there's a problem. Because we must have nurture to live, nurture is a part of the right to life. You must have nurture to be alive. Therefore, just by breathing, you are worthy of love and compassion and nurture and empathy. And I would venture a guess that the vast majority of us are not getting that. Okay. So I want to remind you today that you do not have to be exploitable to anybody to be worthy of love. You don't have to be exploitable to anybody to be worthy of compassion. You don't have to be exploitable to anybody to be worthy of breathing. We live in a society that exploits you until it kicks you out on the streets and thinks that your worth is based on a dollar amount that you can be exploited for, right? So please today remember that you are worthy of love, grace, empathy, just by drawing breath. And that those of us who can see the problem is there can change the problem. We can affect change. Therefore, being aware of the problem makes you more worthy because you are those who can help affect change in society and ensure that we get back to a space that we were at. Thank you so much, Aubrey. How do we fix this? How do we fix what's going on? How do we fix a society that teaches you to hate the houseless person instead of hate the government that's stealing from you, right? How do we fix that? Land back on a global scale. Returning tending and governance to Indigenous people on a global scale means that the climate destruction that Western-based agriculture is currently causing around the globe ends. That we return to a more communal interaction with the world around us, the land around us, that is going to heal the planet and take us from a space where we are eradicating our species to a space of survivability. And animism is a key part of indigeneity, that connection both spiritually and culturally and communally with the land. Communally is a huge, important part of that animistic thought process that is the Indigenous thought process. Community. Care for community. When Europeans got to Turtle Island, there were no orphans. Even if your mother and father had died, the community cared for you. There were no starving elders. Even if you're too old to do something that somebody else calls work, you're still a valuable member of community, right? So that communal sense that we are all lacking and that we all need is also returned with global land back to Indigenous people. Returning tending and governance means that governance, that's governance of community and governance of land, right? That's how we interact with each other. And that goes to a democratical thought process, right? Current Constitution was founded on the Iroquois Constitution, right? So that autonomy, that equality, that's an Indigenous thought process. And returning to that on a global scale gives a communal scale that is much healthier and much better. And again, Western-based agriculture is causing climate destruction. Climate change happens. Climate destruction does not, right? And Western-based agriculture is doing that. So returning tending and governance, that tending part of community, that tending part of animism, that tending part of who we are as a species, and that tending part of Indigenous culture. So land back on a global scale fixes the problem. And the problem only gets fixed when enough of us are aware and are working on it, right? And one more time, all you have to do is breathe to be worthy of being a member of community, to be worthy of love and compassion and empathy. All you have to do is draw a breath. Okay? So give yourself love and grace today. I'm going to guarantee that there's probably not a lot of people giving it to you. One thing that I've been trying to remind people recently is that even in the times that I thought that people didn't love me around me, when it's pointed out to me afterwards, there's almost always people who actually did love me. Whether they were right close or not, there was always people that love me. And I can guarantee you that there is people in your life who love you today that you've known forever, maybe, right? And I know that I love you just by breathing, just by being a part of the solution, just by trying, just by waking up every morning. I love you. You are loved, and you are worthy of that love, and you are worthy of compassion, empathy, and grace. Take care of yourself because you deserve it. Love yourself because you deserve it. Okay? And take care of yourself today. Much love, everybody. I'll try and come back in a couple of days. Again, it's a little hectic here, so it's getting a little bit hard. But I'll try and come back in a couple of days and we'll talk again. We might do this subject. We might go back to Denny because Denny fascinates me. But we'll talk again soon. Take care, everybody. Have a great day. Bye. Take care, YouTube. Have a great day.